We are in for a special treat. We have with us today the wonderful Reverend Dr. David Ault. And I would like to share, let's start there. And before we open our hearts and minds even more, I would like to share a little of his wonderful background. David Ault is a visionary leader in the Humane Potential Movement who has been promoting mindfulness, global literacy, and social justice for over 30 years. He has traveled the world as a teacher and heart-centered guide with the sole purpose of bridging our collective forgetfulness into our great collective reawakening. As an award-winning author, leadership and personal coach, and global education advocate, he exemplifies his motto that people would rather see a lesson than hear one. He's the founder of the Kaleidoscope Child Foundation, a nonprofit organization that empowers vulnerable children and communities worldwide with sustainable education, life skills, and clean water. David is also an avid adventurer. He has hiked the Inca Trail to the ruins of the Machu Picchu in Peru, twice trekked across the ancient pilgrimage known as the Camino de Santiago, and summited Kilimanjaro in Africa. David regularly leads groups and sacred site journeys, service trips, and constantly marvels at the wisdom gained through cultural immersion. And all of that is wonderful. And the love that emanates from this being is something I'm so grateful we all get to experience. Please help me welcome Reverend Dr. David Ault.
I'd like to imagine that if there was something like the pearly gates, that Marcy Baruch would be there with the welcome packets. She was but one element of facilitation that created this beautiful portal, your own Reverend Karen being another one, and all of these amazing participants all operating at the same level of consciousness and willingness to do the work, culminating here with all of you. It was a Sunday, just like this kind of Sunday. It was behind a pulpit, just like this pulpit, where I was in my long-running tenure at the Center for Spiritual Living in Atlanta. And it was another Sunday where another tragedy had happened during the middle of the week. And if you know the life and the mechanics of a minister, we're crafting the message that we're going to talk about. We're sometimes going by a theme. We're trying to do everything to prepare in order to serve you. And these life events keep happening. And I would come to the realization that everything that had been prepared was useless with regards to what was going on. I was blessed to be, and still am, in Atlanta, one of the great melting pots of humanity and culture. And our center had everything. It was like a zoo. We were just multitudes. It was like a New Thought arc where just everything was coming in there. And it was such a privilege to be a part of that and to help guide that. And so I knew that when these things would occur, it very deeply affected a small group of our membership or our congregation. And so it wasn't something that could be passed over. And so the challenge became, how do we take the most singular fundamental principle of this teaching and all spiritual teachings, and that is that there is only one reality. There is only one thing. We call that thing God. God the good. We call it infinite intelligence. We call it source. And the only reality is this love. How do you teach that? When these cycles of human events continue relentlessly over and over again. And so it was somewhere juxtaposed between the Charleston shootings and the Pulse shootings and this litany of stuff that I found myself going, wow. And all that I can tell you is it felt something like an out-of-body experience. So here I was, and I was praying. I could actually hear and watch myself say these words, these affirmative prayer words that we're all so familiar with. There is only one power and one presence. And I'm sort of hovering over my body as I'm saying this, and I can actually see, just like in this crowd, just like this morning. And I felt this really weird unsettling within me. And I hear this voice. Yes, I am a little bit crazy. I hear this voice, and it says, "Do you really believe that?" That's a little unnerving. After decades and decades of riding on the coattails of intellect and deep study and thought, and it came to this pivotal moment, and it said, "Do you really believe that?" And it was so perfectly timed because I was in this state of, I'll call it fresh doubt. It wasn't an old, stale doubt. This was a new, fresh doubt. Wow, look at the cyclical nature of doubt. And here it was, and it was just booming inside of me, and I think it was the wearing down of a sort of safety net that I had created that, yeah, sure, I can talk about this. Sure, I can talk about this. And I can talk about this by relying on this thing called intellect. And I began to see that the intellect has its limits. And the question was coming from something that was not born of the intellect. It was born from, what do you think? The heart. And it said, "Do you really believe that?" And I hesitated, and I said, "I don't know." There may have even been a little shrug, like an emoji. "I don't know." And there was a pause. I'm still watching me giving this prayer, and it said, "Do you want to know?" I thought, oh boy, what am I getting myself into? Do you want to know that God is all that there is? That there is a divine order? And up until that point in time, I had always operated from a mantra called "I am available." Long ago, on a plane ride somewhere, I had been reading an airline magazine, and this travel writer had said in the magazine, the most powerful mantra that you can ever say is, "I'm available." And then afterwards it said, look out, because if you're sincere, your whole world will change. My greatest teacher came from an airline travel magazine. And I told many stories of how I defaulted to, fell into that mantra time and time again. And this felt like the same thing was about to be asked of me. Do you really want to know that God is all that there is? And I didn't say the words exactly, "I'm available." What I said was, more than anything. And from that morning on, my life as I knew it, cushioned in my intellect, priding myself in doing my best and showing up and doing what I think I was doing very, very well, began to systematically crumble. And fast forward several years after that, I get this odd email from someone named Michael Beckwith. Perhaps you are familiar with him in Los Angeles, inviting me to come to this place in Costa Rica and to work and study with these indigenous elders. And at first I was like, nah, that's not my bag. And then he emailed me again. I don't really have a relationship with Michael Beckwith, and I got 2 emails. And up until that, things had slowly been shedding, and I finally said yes. And after a series of several years of that, of decomposing, thoughts, allowing ego. You know, there's not just one ego death. Have you ever heard that phrase, the ego death? There's a lot of them. And it just cycles and cycles. And everything that is a precious identity that the intellect wants to hold on to, that we've worked really hard for, all the letters after our name, all the accomplishments that we have, it's like, do you want to see what is beyond that? The mantra, I'm available, is what happens when you get to the back of the wall of riding the horse as far as it's going to go. And it appears as though there's nothing else, and it goes, do you want to know what's beyond that? And you can say, I'm available. Look out, your whole world will change. And I had said, more than anything, years into that process, one of the most terrifying and horrifying realities emerged. And I had, as a minister, worked with so many people with so many backgrounds and so many issues, including things like dissociative trauma. Never once giving a hair's breadth that had anything to do with me. And here I am in Costa Rica, in a maloca, in the jungle, in this ceremony, and I am back at Mrs. Delaney's house in Beaumont, Texas, my birthplace. Mrs. Delaney was the poor man's daycare center. Long before there were regulations, I am that old. And I grew up in a very, very poor area, and she sort of had collected all the people and was taking care of them. And I was back in Mrs. Delaney's living room. From the time of my infancy to right before I started first grade, I would walk the block to Mrs. Delaney's. Even not as an infant, someone would carry me. But when I could walk, I was going there. So it was like a second home to me. And I was there, and the details are not important, but I will just say that there was quite a bit of violence, quite a bit of abuse, and I was experiencing it in real time. I couldn't see the face, but I was experiencing it in real time, and I willed myself out of the ceremony. I willed myself out of it. It was so horrifying and so shocking. And the instructions were that if you needed assistance, you come to the shaman in the middle of the maloca, and they will assist you. And I went up, and he was working with somebody. And someone asked, David, are you okay? And I said some things, and they suggested that I walk back to my little mattress and to ask the Ault if what I saw was real. My intellect was so wrapped up still in wanting to make sure that it wasn't imaginative. I wanted facts. That I went back and I laid down, and one of the assistants at this beautiful, beautiful healing place came up to me as I was groggily walking, and she said, David, I just want you to be aware that Galaxy is in your bed. Galaxy was the dog on the property in Costa Rica. She was neither mean nor friendly. She was zen. She was a black female lab. Everybody, of course, wants to go and pet Galaxy because she's so magnetic, and she just is non-responsive, staring off into space. She's working. Don't bother Galaxy. And of all of these people, almost 90 people in this maloca, she had walked in during ceremony and gone and gotten into my bed. And I said, what am I supposed to do? And she said, obviously, she's there to work with you. So just be mindful when you lay down. Many of you probably sleep with animals. They take over your bed. Galaxy had taken over my bed, so I'm like scooting in, and I'm in this just, my heart is pounding. I can't believe what I've just seen. And I closed my eyes and I said, is this real? And at that moment, Galaxy took her head, laid it across my chest, and my entire heart burst. I was in my late 50s, and decades of grief and things locked in from self-preservation were unleashed like a fire hose, all in that one single moment, and I could not contain myself. I was beautifully assisted, and all that I know is that hours later, when I came out, I felt as though whoever David was not the same. I was raw. I came back to Atlanta. I had no resources other than a few trusted friends that I wanted to talk about these things with, and I did, and they were beautiful, and they were supportive. And then the next ceremony picked up right where it left off, sometime after that, and it was my father. I had no idea. I had painted a picture about my father. I'm the baby of the family, and it wasn't just me, it was all of my siblings. I had a brother who was a professional baseball player. He was signed to the Toronto Blue Jays, and he was in the opening franchise when they had their first opening game. He made baseball history by hitting 2 home runs in the opening game of a beginning franchise. It was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. He was the brute man in Canada. And we came from nothing, and he made $1 million+ and shot himself in the head. And other similar things with all of the rest of my siblings. And here am I going, why? What am I supposed to do with this? Do you want to know? More than anything. So I go back, picks up right again. My father died when I was 7, and he died in the VA hospital in Houston, Texas. And the narrative that I was told was that he had tried to get out, he had heart issues. I had the same genetic heart malfunction as he did. So did many of my siblings, so did some of my nieces and nephews. And at the time, they didn't have any technology to understand how to remedy that. And he had gotten up to take a shower and collapsed. They labeled it as a heart attack, and he died at the age of 54 in this shower. And I'm taken to the shower, hovering above, almost like a movie. And I could see him turn the water on. I saw all of a sudden his body collapse, an attendant nurse come in and find him. And I'm staring, hearing the water falling upon my father, and the voice said, "Tell him, well done, thy good and faithful servant." I grew up Pentecostal, so it was as if the wisdom of all of that used biblical words that I could understand. If you're familiar, if you grew up in that background, there is a parable that Jesus told about a famous landowner who praised his workers by saying, "Well done, thy good and faithful servant." If you go to funerals, memorials, you'll hear people say, "Well done, thy good and faithful servant," to honor someone who has lived an exemplary life. And this voice is telling me to tell my father in the shower, "Well done, thy good and faithful servant." Remember that vow? I said, more than anything, I'm available. I said, I'm not available. I didn't exactly say it, but boy, the pushback. I was like, whoa, you're going to have to give. I appreciate what you're trying to do, and no. And it was like I was willing to stay stuck. I mean, it just felt too big of a leap. And there was a great persistence, and it said, "Tell him, well done, thy good and faithful servant." Three's the charm. Tell him, "Well done, thy good and faithful servant." And so it came out of my mouth. And as soon as I completed it, he looked up at me and he gave me 2 thumbs up. And he said, "You got it." And I said, "Got what?" you understand. Nothing is as it seems. The biggest perpetrators of our grief are there to assist on this inexplicable soul journey. And in order for us to bring validity and integrity to a non-dualistic principle that says the only reality is God, how are you going to jump from the intellect to the heart and fully embody that? Because it's one thing to memorize something from a book. It's one thing from someone like me to have heard it from a lineage of teachers, to espouse it, to ride that horse as far as it's going to go, and then, I don't know about this. Would you like to know? More than anything. Here's one way. Are you able to see him as a divine teacher, as a gatekeeper, if you will? And the pieces of this story go on and on and on. In fact, that intellect of mine, that engineering mind, still doubted whether or not I was making all of this up. And a girl that was at Mrs. Delaney's house with me found me on Facebook right after that. And we connected, and I felt it was appropriate to share with what had happened. And she confirmed similar experiences of what had both happened. And she said, we were the only two kids there. My memory was like there was a bunch, and she said, no, it was just you and me. And the lesson of well done, thy good and faithful servant in that moment did not then stop with me relaying those words to my father. The great lesson in that was that now becomes your new mantra that you say to everything about you and the external world that you are disowning. Everything that you are pushing away. Everything physically that you might be cursing. It said, take your hands, put it on the joints that hurt, and say to the joint, well done, thy good and faithful servant. Begin to list all those perpetrators of your greatest grief, those that you harbor resentment at. Begin to put pictures up to them and go, well done, thy good and faithful servant. And I was like, wow, that's a bit much. And then I remembered one of my favorite teachers, Ram Dass, talking about something very similar. And he said his issue was with somebody named Caspar Weinberger. If you remember, whoever the Department of Defense was, he just struggled with this man. And his teacher said to him the same thing. If you go to bed at night and you have put anyone outside of your heart, then you are limiting your access to this universal principle. So Ram Dass had an altar in his home, and he had Anandama and Yogananda and Jesus and Mother Mary and all of these other great saints, his own guru, and he had a picture of Caspar Weinberger on his altar. And every morning he would come, good morning, Jesus. Good morning, Krishna. Good morning, Buddha. Anandama. Hello, Caspar. And the more that he continued to do those types of things, the more then our belief system isn't segmented. That yes, the principle is true as long as. And it becomes something that then steps off of the bus of intellect and moves into the transportation of the heart. It reminded me, because I had to do a lot of mirror work. My first teacher was the first person who ever stuck a mirror in my face. Her name was Louise Hay. She became my second mom. I was in a trio called Alliance, and I stumbled upon her, and she became not only my first science of mind teacher, but my surrogate mom. And we would travel together because we formed this music, and she was gracious enough when she became big to take us with her on the road. And I remember one time being very disappointed about an audition in my actor life. And I said, boy, I wish I had grown up different, and this had been different, and this had been different. And she used to have these beautiful nails. And I would sit next to her in the traveling van, and one time, after the 900th time of saying, I wish things were different, she took her beautiful, beautiful nails, dug them into my knee, and said, need I remind you to honor the entirety of your journey? That never fully landed until that Maloka. And I began to see there actually is an intricate divine order. And if we are willing to say, I'm available, it will take us to points unknown, and it will ask us to practice over and over and over again. Well done, thy good and faithful servant. And I want to ask you this morning then, if you would close your eyes with me as we end this prayer. Let's make it personal. Let's take our hands, and if you want to place them on your heart, if you want to place them somewhere on your body that perhaps when you look in the mirror, you make some derogatory statement, you can touch that part, one hand on that part, one part on your heart. And you can begin to practice with me, breathing deeply, saying, well done, thy good and faithful servant. Well done, thy good and faithful servant. Draw to mind someone that you're in conflict with. Are you available to use our shared fundamental principle in looking at them and seeing the perfection of this karmic relationship? Could it be possible that things are not as they seem, and that they are a gateway, a portal, to bring us to an altar of practice where we can begin to operate fully from the heart and say to them, well done, thank you, well done, thy good and faithful servant. And lastly, may you look into the mirror. May you make a commitment every single day that you do not leave your home, you do not begin your activities until you give great, delicious pause and you stare at that reflection in front of you and you say, well done, thy good and faithful servant. Breathe together with me. And so may it be, so shall it be, and so it is.